The woolen jumper on the dummy is a knitted jumper. That means that if it gets a hole in it, it'll ladder. So you must be careful when you're actually lowering the neckline. Place your tape measure at the center front and put a chalk mark for the measurement down and then up for the seam allowance. I've moved around 2 inches to one side and placed it, then come around and do the same thing, 2 inches, and then place your chalk mark for your new length and your seam allowance, and then do that on the shoulders. Now if you're pretty good with your hands, I mean, I just free-handed it around, coming around with my chalk. This is actually a Chaco chalk marker. They're absolutely excellent for doing clothing alterations. So this is going to be the cut line, but we're not going to cut it until we've actually stitched it. So turn it around the back, center back, it's 2 inches, up for the seam allowance, and then just bring that around to meet up. Now be careful that you never get that you don't actually lower the shoulders too far. Otherwise, you know, sometimes you see people, if you do lower the shoulders too much, it'll actually fall off your shoulders. And draw your line around. So again, this is your cut line. So now we come to the stitching and the cutting. I've stitched around between the 2 chalk marks in the middle, because you're going to cut on the chalk mark that's closest to the neckline. When it comes to cutting, use very sharp scissors and try not to cut the stitching. The stitching is actually doing 2 things. It's stopping the knit from unraveling when you cut it, and it's also securing the neckline to keep it into shape, because if you didn't stitch it, it would more than likely stretch out of shape. So just very carefully go around. I have sped up the video just a little bit, only because I was trying to save download time. And you should end up with something like that. When you're pinning the bias binding around the neckline, you already have the stitch line which has secured the knit, but you do want to make sure that you don't stretch it. In actual fact, what I do is kind of push it in a little bit between the pins. You're not going to gather it on, but you're going to actually make sure that you haven't stretched the knit. Perhaps even when it was stitched, it might have been stretched a bit. So you just want to sort of push it in so that the knit maintains the rib that it's got. When sewing the bias binding onto the knit jumper, begin sewing about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters in front of the shoulder seam where you're going to place the bias join, and put the needle into the fold line of the bias binding, and then sew around the neckline, sewing into the fold of the bias. You'll also notice that I pull the pins out with the head facing towards me. It's a lot easier if you do that as you sew. And now I've actually got a pin cushion attached to the front of my machine, so I just pop it into the pin cushion. As you're sewing, also make sure that the rib of the knit is side by side. If it's stretched too much, then you'll get a gather. So as you come around to the shoulder again, just stop about 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres from the end so that you can actually put a join in. When you're joining the bias, just lay one side of the bias down and pop a pin right on the join at the shoulder seam inside the bias, and then put the other section of the bias, the opposite side, across and do the same thing. Now you've actually got where the bias will sit on the join, and then all you have to do is pop those two pins together, and that's where the join will be in the bias, and it will be right on the shoulder. Now I haven't sewn the bias in a diagonal because I want the join to actually be the same as on the shoulder seam. A little bit of fiddling here just to make sure that when you sew the bias you've got all the fold seams line up perfectly so that it looks nice and neat. And also, just when you're doing it, lock off. Now you'll see there I'm using a pin. I'm sorry about my hands being in the way, it's a bit hard with the video there, but lock off at the beginning and at the end, but actually try not to actually catch the fabric. And then if you just clip the excess out of the way, and then I always open out seams, particularly when you're doing things like this. So just lay the two seams flat so that you can actually sew it. And it's probably a good idea, if you want to, you can pin it in place. Because I do this so often, I tend to just pop it under the machine and sew. And make sure that those two seams are flat. I think I'll use a pin in a minute, just so I pop the pin and then just hold the bias binding seams flat so that I sew straight over the top. Understitching just means folding the seam allowance flat on the garment, and then the bias binding or whatever has been attached to it on the top, laying that flat and stitching around on the very edge. What this does is it allows the bias to lay flat when you fold it over. Before stitching it down, just go around and trim off the excess. It's better to do it afterwards rather than before. It's a lot harder to stitch and knit like this when you've only got a little bit to sew with. So just go around and trim that completely all the way around. If you've got a very curved neckline, you might want to just clip in a little bit, but if you cut it close to the understitching, you should be fine. Unfortunately, when I was videoing this, you can't see me turning the bias over, but I generally try and start at the join and fold the the join down and get that sitting correctly, because I want that join to be right on the shoulder. So that's what I was doing, just making sure that the two seam allowances are open and flat. So then if you just stitch around the on the edge of the bias, trying to keep the same width all the way around. You'll notice how I tend to push the knit in towards the foot. I do that with my left index finger. I do that so that it actually stops any stretching or pulling. If you just let it go, it may tend to stretch or pull a little bit. So if you sort of ease it in with your finger as you go, and I guess that comes down to your own sewing techniques that you use. I mean, I've done a lot of altering of knits over the years, and this one works for me. Now you'll notice that the join on the shoulder, that hasn't even been ironed, and yet it looks quite nice and neat. Notice the seam allowances are both open. There's your before photo of your knit with a high neck, and there's your after with a lower neck. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'm sure you've got lots of jumpers you'd love to now alter and make low necks. Happy sewing.